All right, welcome everyone to Build Better Habits and Procedures with ForeFlight. This is the next webinar we're doing in our Pilot in Command with the Pros series. And for this webinar, we'll have our social media influencer, Josh Flowers, along with a member of our ForeFlight support team, Chris Mauser. So Josh Flowers is the host of Aviation101.com. He's a CFII, ASEL, and ASES. Definitely go check out his website or check out his channel on YouTube. You can find him at Aviation 101 as well there. And then Chris Mauser is our customer success coordinator. He's a CFII and an MEI, and he also participated in a previous webinar in this series with Jason Miller, also known as the Finer Points to Flying. So definitely go check out that webinar to hear more great, insightful tips from Chris. So the topics for today, we're going to start with an introduction to promoting safe practices and how you can make those safe practices turn into habits. This is a key aspect of how Josh teaches his students. It's a really important component of his entire philosophy when it comes to aviation and safe flying. So most of what he's going to be talking about in this webinar will essentially revolve around that idea of taking really important practices and making them essential habits. So we'll move from in kind of a chronological order from pre-flight planning, some of the tips he has for that section of planning, moving into prior to takeoff, in-flight habits, and finally some post-flight habits you can develop to help with debriefing and just better looking back and understanding how you did on a flight. So before we get started, you can ask any questions via the GoToWebinar message panel on the right. Click that button that looks like a question mark inside a speech bubble, and you can type in questions at the bottom there and send them to us. We will have staff members responding to your questions as much as they can during the webinar, and we will also be responding live to some questions during Q&A at the very end. On that note, I strongly recommend that you submit questions whenever you think of them. Don't wait until you see Q&A on the screen, because if you submit a question, once we've already gotten into the Q&A at the end, your question will probably not be answered. So strongly recommend that you submit them as soon as you think of them, and then you're more likely to get an answer to it. We also strongly recommend that you join this webinar from a computer and not a mobile device. We've just found that mobile devices tend to have more issues with audio and sometimes video. So definitely recommend joining from a laptop or desktop computer. And lastly, the session is being recorded, and you'll be able to access it later at foreflight.com/webinars, as well as on our YouTube channel. So with that, let's get started. Josh, take it away.
Really appreciate the introduction. I'm super happy to be here. I love working with all of you wonderful people here at ForeFlight. Y'all have been an awesome sponsor of Aviation 101 for a few years now, and I really value the partnership we've built. And I absolutely love ForeFlight and the product that all of y'all have put together over the years, and it has really become a integral part of my workflow and my flying. And of course, what we're going to talk about today is that workflow and how it has formed my habits and kind of how good habits and bad habits interact and how it kind of creates us as individual pilots. And it's some kind of interesting concepts that I'm going to talk to. And Chris, I'm super happy to be doing this with you too. I think we've had some good conversations over the last couple of days, and I think you and I are pretty similar as kind of pilots and CFIs in terms of our mentality and the way we like to look at things. So I'm super happy that we're here to get to do this. To start off, we're talking about learning good habits just right from the beginning. Of course, with flight instruction, I think one of the most important concepts around flight instruction is the fundamentals of instructing, the FOI, which is a huge topic you learn when you become a CFI. It's one that I personally struggled with, and I kind of hated it. I don't know if I'm sure you can kind of relate to that, Chris. I've heard of a lot of people kind of having issues with the topic of fundamentals of instructing, but there is one thing that I really took from the FOI, and as I was learning it, that I think holds a lot of value these days in my flight instruction, and really in lots of parts of life for that matter. And that's the law of primacy. This title on this slide here, Learning Good Habits from the Beginning, really speaks to the importance of the law of primacy. They're kind of synonymous here. Learning a good habit right from the beginning, whether you're being shown that habit by a CFI, or you're being, something is being demonstrated to you, or you're just learning something for the first time, learning it correctly from the beginning and learning a good habit from the beginning is super, super important. So that kind of leads into this first question that I get all the time, and it's kind of, kind of at the base of learning good habits from the beginning, is should I let a student use an iPad for planning and navigation? As somebody is coming up through their private pilot certificate, you're learning so many things. It's a whole nother language and just this whole realm of an industry and you could call it a sport or whatever you may consider it as. It's a whole new world for a student. So one of the things, of course, that can present itself to be a challenge is learning about navigation. I learned how to fly using paper charts. I learned how to navigate with paper charts and filling out paper nav logs and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it was incredibly beneficial for me to learn the basics right from the beginning. To this day, I may be a little bit rusty, but if you asked me today to fly from point A to point B without an iPad, I could do it because I understand those basics. And I think that is a very, very important thing for a student becoming a pilot to have that understanding of basic navigation and how a map works and how the flight plan features on ForeFlight. How does that feature even get to these numbers of estimated time and route and your course and considering winds aloft and all that kind of stuff? I have an opinion about letting a student use an iPad for planning and navigation, and that is that I think it's a good thing to let the student start playing with these tools and getting familiar with these tools. And of course, the real learning about ForeFlight and all that kind of stuff will happen outside the airplane. And a recurring theme that I'll kind of talk about here is I like to treat the airplane as a learning tool, a supplement to learning, not a classroom. So big topics, introducing big topics or learning how to use ForeFlight, I think should definitely happen outside the airplane. Then you can apply those skills later. I see the fact that a student is going to use ForeFlight in the real world is enough justification for me to want them to go ahead and get familiar with it now. That's not to say that I'm not going to take that iPad away when I see it to be appropriate. What do you think about that, Chris? You've done tons of flight instruction, and I know there's so many angles to this. That's just kind of my one-sided view of it. I came up with paper charts and then started using an iPad about when I was starting my instrument training. And I think it's a good thing to let students get familiar with those tools because that's what they're going to be using in the real world.
Oh yeah. Well, first and foremost, thanks for hosting this with me today.
Yeah.
This is a couple webinars I've done now, and I'm really excited about this one. This topic is so important to me from a flight instructor perspective. Building good habits, right? So when you get into this concept of learning to fly, when you decide to become a pilot and you get with an instructor, that instructor has such an important role in the building blocks of these good habits. In other words, this instructor is there to mold you and teach you and mentor you from the beginning. And why are they doing this? Why are they presenting good habits to you? Because good habits ultimately make you a safer pilot. That's what it's all about, right? It's about becoming a safer pilot. So doing these good habits are so important because they're going to just bolster and enhance your safety margins. And they're going to be with you in times of adversity, right? Flying is tough. Not everybody can do it. But having good habits is going to pull you through some tough times that you have while flying. It's going to maybe even prevent you from having issues while flying. Having good habits can totally circumvent any issues that if maybe you had a bad habit. On top of that, developing bad habits, and what is a bad habit? I think a bad habit is anything that in the long run makes your safety less safe, right? So
right.
Breaking bad habits is so much more work for the student, for the CFI, because you can't let bad habits go unchecked. Kind of moving it into the kind of the concept of where I stand with iPad or ForeFlight for that matter. I'm all about it. Obviously I work for ForeFlight, but I was a huge ForeFlight user and advocate before I signed on with ForeFlight. And one of the things I personally like to do is on purpose make my students start off with paper charts, not because again, I don't want them to know ForeFlight, but it's a little bit of kind of a little thing I like to show them is like, look what you have to do manually with paper and look at all the paper you have to carry. And then when they're ready, when they have the bandwidth, yes, I will transition them over to the iPad, and you just watch their eyes, get wide and the light bulbs go off and like, wow, why did you not introduce this to me sooner?
Absolutely. And in terms of habits, I want a student or any pilot for that matter, to build good habits right from the start, including the law of primacy there, that will eventually revolve around the tools that they're going to be using in the real world. When we're talking about habits, to me, there's three elements of a habit. And I mainly got this part of how I kind of form habits in my head from a book called The Power of Habit. It's a fantastic book that I read a couple of years ago, and I'm entertaining reading it again. There's also another book called The Checklist Manifesto that kind of talks about some similar topics here. So the three key components of a checklist item or of a habit, and I'm mainly talking about habits here, but it's very similar to checklist items. There's a cue, there's a response, and a reward. So the cue is basically, it's the trigger that begins your habit. For example, like whenever I do any sort of a configuration change in the airplane, that's like my subconscious cue to reach down and pull out the checklist or tap the checklist tab on ForeFlight. And if I don't switch over to the checklist, something feels wrong. Like I have this gut feeling that's kind of like, ooh, I'm missing something. And that is to do the checklist. So that's my cue. Anytime I make a configuration change in the airplane, or like when I taxi up to the hold short line of the runway, apply the brakes and come to a full stop. When I feel the airplane come to a full stop, that's my cue that I am now in the habit of recognizing that I need to now pull out my checklist and do something with it. The second aspect, or the second component rather, of a habit is the response. And that's the action that occurs as a result of the cue. So you have a cue that kind of begins your habit, and then you have your response that basically is that's the meat and potatoes of the habit. That's what actually happens. And then you have the reward. The reward is the benefit or the satisfaction that comes as a result of the response. So, your checklist item is done. The flight is now safer. Or my cue is when I come to the hold short line and I apply the brakes and come to a full stop. That's my cue. My response is to bring out the checklist and execute the checklist. My reward is I get to take off now. We're safe and we're ready to go and good to go for takeoff. So that's kind of how I break all of this stuff down in my head. Do you apply any of these concepts, Chris, in your flight instruction? Like when I read this stuff in The Power of Habit and I became familiar with cue, response, reward, a light bulb went off in my head and I was like, oh, wow, I have definitely recognized that in a number of ways in my flying, both in good ways and bad ways. Do you recognize that in your students very much?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, of course, we don't use checklists in the flight deck for, just because we're looking for other things to do. They are definitely a part of flying. The checklist from a beginner pilot, from a student pilot perspective, they don't know what they don't know. So a checklist helps them run through a certain phase of flight and feel good at the end of the checklist that they have accomplished that reward portion of it, right? They now know they have something tangible in front of them that they can cross-check to make sure they're not missing anything, and that gives them a sense of accomplishment, and it helps them move forward because as we all know, flying is very dynamic, right? Airplanes moving at X amount of knots per hour, and if you're not up to speed mentally with it, that airplane is gonna be, what do they say, that you're getting behind the airplane, right? So
exactly.
That's super important.
Absolutely. And so kind of transitioning from the introduction here about habits and checklists and the structure there, I want to talk a little bit about kind of my workflow when it comes to ForeFlight and pre-flight planning and how, as soon as I get the idea for a flight, where do I go? What's the first response that I have as a result of my cue? Of course, my cue is a friend texts me and says, hey, let's go to Fredericksburg for breakfast. That's my cue. My response is the beginning of my habit, and that is to pull out ForeFlight. I drop down the flight plan button to get the flight plan widget up there, and I just type in a flight plan. Like right here, a flight plan to El Paso. This gives me like a bird's eye view of what this is going to look like. What's my route going to look like? What kind of terrain are we dealing with? What kind of airspace are we dealing with? So that's my very first thing with my workflow. And this is all a deeply ingrained habit now. As a student pilot, kind of growing up in the realm of aviation, and gaining our experience and learning, I was in the habit of, okay, we're going to plan a flight. I go to my flight bag and pull out a sectional and unfold it, get my forearm and wipe everything off the kitchen table and lay out this giant sectional. And that's how we do it. But over the years, of course, as ForeFlight's progressed and myself as a pilot and flight instructor have advanced, this is my workflow now. This is my habit. So the first thing I do is I type the route into the flight plan editor. That's the very first thing that I think is the easiest to do to get a route right there up on the screen. And when I get kind of an idea of the route there, then I start, checking out what's the daily forecast look like. That can allow me to kind of narrow down, what day do I want to depart? What time of the week do we want to go? That kind of stuff. Once I've got the route into the flight plan editor, let's be honest, the weather in El Paso is always clear skies, but we can go ahead and look at that right here. So, if we go to El Paso here and then pull some weather, you get your METARs, your D-ATIS, TAF, MOS, everything. And then you've got your daily forecast that is, just like this very layman's terms, very bird's eye view, big picture kind of what does the weather look like? And of course, in El Paso, it's clear skies, clear skies, clear skies. My workflow would kind of look like I'd go back to the map and I'd select our estimated time of departure and select Friday, November 12th. And let's say we're going to depart at 1600 Zulu there. So what that does is it puts this data into ForeFlight telling it what day and what time we want to leave. So then that's going to help me with my next step. And that is, okay, well, what altitude do I want to go at? And what is my estimated time en route going to look like? ForeFlight's already got all that data right here. Distance, 459 nautical miles on that route. Estimated time en route, 4 hours and 30 minutes based on the current altitude that I have selected. Right here, we can pull up some altitudes. And it's already going to tell me what the wind is at all these altitudes because it's pulling that winds aloft forecast. And I remember during training going through and listening to a weather briefer list out altitudes that I requested, at certain waypoints, certain stations and stuff. So just a super, super nice tool to be able to plan a flight here and pick an altitude. It's already got my headwinds and tailwinds and everything, tells me exactly what the wind is going to do and the difference in estimated time en route, how much fuel I'm going to burn in the Skyhawk, which is what I have set in the top right corner there. So it's just overall a super nice way to put all of this together. So continuing to kind of talk about our kind of pre-flight planning, there's another aspect of this that I want to talk about, and that is verifying settings on your iPad. And this kind of moves away from actually planning out the route on the map and stuff. When I want to talk about verifying settings on ForeFlight, I'm talking about alerts mainly. And I had an experience with my dad where we were doing some training and kind of playing around with situational awareness and talking about a few different topics there. And we realized that on his iPad, his terrain and obstacle alerts on ForeFlight were disabled. The little toggles were turned off. It's a very easy setting to get to. You just tap more and go to settings, and then you'll get right there and find the alerts at the very bottom. But I think it's super, super important to make sure these alerts are on. Not only to increase your situational awareness about what's going on, but it gets your attention. And I definitely have had instances where ForeFlight has said something over the intercom or said something out loud over the speakers that got my attention, whether it be for traffic. And I also a long time ago came across a setting in my iPad on ForeFlight where traffic alerts were turned off. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, I need to turn that on. I must have turned it off at some point. So I like to just go in and make sure every now and then if I've updated the iPad, I've updated the software, or if I'm using somebody else's iPad, which is kind of a rare instance, I like to just make sure the settings are where I'm expecting them to be, if that makes sense. I know we talked about interfacing the iPad with Bluetooth audio on the intercom too, which is another thing. So you can hear those alerts. But
yeah, I mean, so I started flying before EFBs or ForeFlight was around, right? So I got used to, using all my paper. And one of those things that I got used to doing was making sure I had all the correct charts, make sure I pre-flighted the airplane, right? Well, now that we have ForeFlight, that's something that you need to be cognizant of. You need to pre-flight your iPad, right? You need to make sure that it's got the batteries charged. You make sure that you're on the most up-to-date ForeFlight version. Make sure that you've got different things downloaded correctly, your settings done correctly. So yeah, you just, it's such a convenient tool, but like anything, software or whatever, it's supposed to enhance and accentuate your flight. But if you don't properly set it up, it's not going to do what you need it to do. So you're the in charge of that. You're the PIC of your own iPad. So you just make sure you spend a little bit of time doing that, and maybe you add that as a part of a checklist item on your pre-flight planning checklist to remind you to pre-flight your iPad.
Absolutely. And I love how you put that. You need to pre-flight your iPad, pre-flight your device. And then, of course, in terms of connectivity, what I was going to say about audio is getting those alerts in the airplane can be a little, it's coming from an iPad. It's not coming from your panel mounted avionics. So I have a bit of an older audio panel in the Skyhawk, but it does have an aux music jack. So you can plug something in. I just bought this little $20 Bluetooth receiver on Amazon, plugged it into the intercom system, and that connects straight to my iPad. So the audio alerts that come up on ForeFlight while I'm flying actually get pumped right into the intercom in the airplane. So I get to hear when ForeFlight says traffic, 2 o'clock, 800 feet below, etc., or if it says caution, obstacle, stuff like that. So that kind of stuff actually comes through my headset, and I don't even have to look down. And then, of course, a feature on the checklist as well is you can have the checklist speak to you, and that's another thing, that this whole concept of pre-flighting a device, making sure you're connected to the things that you need to be connected with, and your alerts are on. Make sure it's actually going to do what you're expecting it to do. So I think those are pretty important. Kind of coming back to the topic of habits. Before even getting into the plane, I have a couple things that I'm definitely in the habit of doing now that I used to not be. And a little story here about this. And I'm very big on checking NOTAMs right before you get in the plane, because NOTAMs can change at your destination airport. Maybe there was a plane that came in and they had a gear issue, and now it's a disabled airplane on the runway. And now that runway is closed. Maybe that runway that is now closed was the only runway that you could shoot an instrument approach to based on your equipment. That kind of ties into the story here. I was attending a Rusty Pilot seminar in Temple, Texas, and I was going to fly a Mooney 201 down to San Marcos to pick up my dad and bring him over to the Rusty Pilot seminar so we could both attend it. It was like 800 or 900 overcast that morning. Could very easily get into San Marcos shooting an ILS. And this Mooney did not have a GPS. So everything was good to go. Airplane's good to go and all that kind of stuff. And I take off. I'm climbing out of the Temple Airport, contact departure. I'm above the cloud layer. It's a beautiful morning. And Austin approach says radar contact, say type approach request at San Marcos. I said, well, I'm looking for the ILS-13. And they came back. They kind of had a pause and came back and said, the ILS-13 is NOTAMed out of service. Can you accept the RNAV-17? I said, negative, or negative GPS. We're slant alpha. And he said, Roger, say intentions. So of course I'm like, all right, well, I guess I'm not getting into San Marcos. That must have been something that I missed. So I told him, just like to turn around and shoot the ILS-15 into Temple and come back around and land. So I turned back around, landed. And as soon as I got on the ground, I went on ForeFlight and checked NOTAMs. And sure enough, there was a NOTAM for the ILS-13, and of course the localizer as well, being out of service at San Marcos. And that's the only approach that I could shoot at San Marcos in that airplane. So I was like, that should be a pretty hard lesson for me to learn here. So I went and sat in that Rusty Pilot seminar by myself without my dad and watched and listened and took notes. And the whole time could not stop thinking about the fact that I just had to turn around and shoot an approach back into my departure airport because I did not check NOTAMs. So a big thing, in my opinion, is to check NOTAMs right before you get in the airplane, because things can change. If you're getting fuel at your destination, just check your destination real quick. Make sure that there are no new NOTAMs saying fuel not available. Make sure the runway didn't just close for some reason. All that kind of stuff. So I think it's pretty important. Do you have anything to add to that, Chris? I know we all probably have little stories about that kind of stuff.
You just read my mind. I'm actually kind of back here smiling, and I think everybody that's listening is kind of smiling if they have even just a little bit of experience in aviation. That we all have that story where we made a mistake, right? We, for whatever reason, get the itis. We're in a hurry. My story, I'll tell briefly, is basically I got a briefing. This is years ago, before ForeFlight. I got a briefing over the phone from a briefer, and if anybody's gotten a briefing over the phone, you listen to the briefer spit out a ton of information. And if you're like me, you're a visual learner, right? So he's saying all this stuff over the phone, and I'm like, just give him, like, trying to soak it in. Well, one of the things he told me that I completely missed was that the airport that I was going to be NOTAM closed for maintenance around my time of arrival. Now, luckily, I was on with flight following, and very similar situation where ATC said, the airport's closed, say your intentions. And I was like, caught way off guard. I'm like, what? So luckily I was able to just divert to my next airport down the line, and it was no big deal, but it really caught me off guard. And I was like, I really wish there was a better way to get NOTAMs. And sure enough, like you said, going into ForeFlight, like, NOTAMs are so conveniently placed all throughout the app.
Exactly. So yeah, before getting in the plane, I'd like to do all of these things, like just check the weather one more time, glance at the map and check to make sure that, radar looks good. There's not a cell that kind of got in my, is creeping into my path, or it changed directions or something like that. And now, a cell popped up. And then check NOTAMs, make sure that, there's not a runway closure that popped up, or there's not a TFR that popped up. And then of course we can brief and pack with ForeFlight. You can pull a full weather briefing that you could get previously with 1-800-WX brief. It gives it all to you right there on your iPad or your iPhone in a visual form. And like you just said, Chris, you're a visual learner. I'm the exact same. I need to look at something, or else I'm going to forget it. And we discussed very briefly, verifying device connections. Make sure that you are connected to your Sentry so you can get that in-flight weather and ADS-B input, and all the ADAHRS data that comes through that into ForeFlight. Verify that you're connected to a Bluetooth audio device so you can get those alerts over your headset. And then another part of the pre-flight briefing where ForeFlight is it's very instrumental is the abort plan briefing. I don't know about you, Chris. I'm sure you've got something very similar here, but I am very big, very, very big on briefing what's going to happen if this takeoff does not go as planned. Maybe we've got some brakes dragging and it's really elongating our takeoff roll. Or maybe it's, the wind shifted, or density altitude is not quite what we calculated it to be. Briefing the abort plan and planning out what's going to happen if you have to abort the takeoff, or if something happens airborne right after takeoff, is really important.
Oh yeah. So first and foremost, if you don't have some kind of abort plan in mind, I actually teach my students to say it out loud. It helps you actually kind of process what you're saying and make it happen. It also makes it real. Like if it really did happen, you would just have said those sentences, seconds ago. You're also doing this abort plan with current information. So I like to see it thought about ahead of time, but actually said out loud in the run-up area before takeoff. There are a couple different tools that I use. Obviously, just getting to know the airport environment is really important. Getting to know the lengths of the runways, where the winds are coming from. So therefore, what runway you're going to take off from and how long it is. What is the terrain situation around the airport? With ForeFlight's 3D perspective, if you're in the performance level subscription, we have literally like 3D imagery of airports of your entire flight. There isn't really any excuse these days to not be fully aware of your surroundings and what you can do before you even leave the ground. So definitely need to research that, have a plan, and you're seeing the 3D here. If you could switch over into the night mode, this is a really cool feature because there are a lot of times where I'm flying into airports that I've never been to, but I'm flying into it at night. And so now I have not only a 3D perspective of the terrain and the land around it, but now I'm actually seeing what the airport looks like in real true to form. This is Jeppesen sourced data, what you would actually see in real life. So getting to know your airport environment and having that abort plan is so important.
And it's even, of course, it's showing traffic right here on the 3D view too. And it's even got, the little lights on top of towers here and there, and they're blinking in the distance. And it shows you, especially like, let's consider shooting an instrument approach. Let's say we're shooting this ILS-13 down to the runway. This kind of gives us an idea of what we're going to see when we pop out of the clouds at minimums. This is what the runway lights are going to look like. Or if we're doing this in the daytime, that's what we're expecting to see when we pop out of the clouds. And then of course, if you're just coming in VFR, it gives you this idea of what the whole airport looks like and kind of how we, what we can expect when we get down here to the airport, or when we're taking off. Another thing about this 3D view is looking at the fields around and kind of looking at the layout of the airport. And, okay, if I'm taking off runway 8 here, could I entertain a left turn over to what's left of runway 35 if I have an engine issue right after takeoff? So kind of things like that, we can use this 3D view really to our advantage and pick out what we're going to do. The other way that I like to, a big portion of briefing the abort plan for me, I'm going to close the 3D view here, and I'm going to zoom into Hotel Yankee India, San Marcos. It's my home airport here. It's the one we were just looking at there. So I'm going to zoom on the aeronautical layer. We can zoom all the way in, and it gets right down to the airport. We're looking at taxiways and runways there. And one of the great features of ForeFlight, I think, is the ruler function. So if you tap and hold two fingers, you can get this little ruler that gives you all sorts of data, including distance in feet and in terms of nautical miles as well. So the way I use that for the abort plan is, in the Skyhawk, I know that, if I've got 3 people in there and we're half tanks, we're probably on your average day in San Marcos, which is 600 feet above sea level, we're probably going to take up about 1,000 feet of runway. So part of my abort plan is, first of all, determining how long our ground roll is going to take. If we're not off by this point on the runway, if we're not up and climbing by that point, something is wrong. We definitely should have been airborne based on our performance data well before that. So let's say we're taking off runway 8 here, runway 08. I'll be like, okay, what's a good visual reference that I can use on runway 8 as we're rocketing down the runway, accelerating to 55 knots? What's a good visual reference that I will easily be able to detect in my peripheral as we're passing it? And that would be, for me, taxiway Bravo is the first big one. If the runway is well painted, you could also use the 1,000-foot markers that are about 1,000 feet down the runway, the big captain bar looking things. Since those are so, blunt and white on the runway, you can see those going by you. But for illustration purposes here, let's just say, I declare taxiway Bravo as my abort point. So I'll say, okay, how far down is taxiway Bravo? So I'll measure this out. And from the approach end, where we'll begin our takeoff roll to taxiway Bravo, it's almost 2,700 feet. So a Cessna 172, even at max gross weight, should be off and healthily climbing by the time we cross taxiway Bravo. So if we're passing taxiway Bravo and we still have not gotten airborne, with applying full power and everything was done correctly, if we're not still airborne by taxiway Bravo, something is definitely wrong. So at that point, we want to chop the power and get on the brakes. And, I use the ruler function again. Okay, how much stopping distance will we have? 3,600 feet to the end of the runway. No problem for a Skyhawk. So that's kind of a brief overview of how I analyze an airport using this aeronautical layer and the ruler function. Just to, how long do I have to my abort point? Okay, we can definitely be up and climbing by that taxiway. If we're not, we should reassess and consider aborting this takeoff, chop the power, get on the brakes. So briefing that abort plan is really big. And then, of course, the second part of the abort plan is once we're off the runway and climbing, if the engine quits or something happens, that 3D view really helps us kind of get, if we're not familiar with the airport, it helps us get a little bit familiar with, what fields are around, or is there a highway off the end of the runway and stuff like that, which before, unless you really studied a map or something, you wouldn't really know until your eye line has broken the tree, the top of the trees, and you're above it and climbing. So by the book, it says that in the conditions that I've laid out in the POH, I should be off and airborne in 960 feet. So no sweat, right? Well, what if something is not as expected? What if a gust front comes and hits you from behind, and you're trying to depart and get out of the way before weather comes in later this afternoon? But what if a gust front hits you? What if your brakes are dragging? What if your feet are on the brakes while you're on the takeoff roll? That's going to really lengthen your takeoff roll. So stuff like that. That's what I like to consider in terms of the abort plan, and ForeFlight lets us slap a metric on that and measure the distance down the runway and say, okay, by that taxiway, we definitely should be off and climbing. If we're not, something is most certainly wrong.
I'll add one more thing. No,
sure.
Let's take this San Marcos, for example. This is a very long runway, so it's kind of like it's a for a 172, it's a no-brainer. But what if the runway was NOTAMed and had a displaced threshold, right? What if it's a lot shorter than you're used to? What if you're flying into a non-familiar airport that's a smaller airport with a much shorter runway? Now all of a sudden, this kind of concept, and again, getting in the habit of doing this becomes way more kind of real, right? It has a lot more power to it. So practicing at your home airport is great, but then you can take that concept and apply it to these kind of more, tougher situations, like I just said. So
absolutely, and I could even illustrate a quick example here. If I come down to the coast here, I know we had a discussion, I believe it was yesterday, about Mustang Beach here. I've gone into that airport a couple times. It's surrounded by kind of marsh and water, and it's definitely a shorter runway. I believe this runway is about 3,500 feet. Yeah, 3,445 is kind of what that shows right there from taxiway to taxiway. And for me, coming down this runway, I always, in the Skyhawk, I'm always using that middle taxiway because that's about the only landmark you've got and taking off toward the ocean on runway 12. There we've got 1,800 feet before that taxiway. And if I'm at rotation speed at that taxiway and I am not airborne, then I need to get on the brakes right there at that taxiway in order to stop in the remaining distance on the runway. So it definitely matters, especially when you get into these shorter runways, and especially with making sure I've got the power and I'm climbing at a healthy rate like the airplane should. There's power lines off the end of runway 12. So I've got to make sure that we're up and climbing. And sometimes there's a kid out there flying a kite on the beach way higher than he needs to be flying it right in the departure path of the runway. So I want to make sure that we're off and climbing and have a healthy engine, and ForeFlight helps us define that metric and really put a number on it and visualize it. So
yeah,
I think
great illustration.
Absolutely priceless feature. So we can kind of move on to some in-flight habits that I like to implement and make sure that I am paying attention to them and make sure that, they're habits, so they usually just happen naturally, but I think they're a very good thing in terms of making sure that I ensure the safety of the flight with the tools that I have here at my disposal, that is ForeFlight. So we talked about having the airport up on the aeronautical view, which is exactly what we were just looking at. And that allows you to see other traffic on the ground too. So when you're, waiting for your clearance for takeoff, sitting there at the foot of the runway, I like to be able to see all the traffic right there around the airport. And I can hear tower call out a tail number, and I can see them right there on ForeFlight if they're equipped with ADS-B. And it's just yet another supplement, along with our eyes and ears that have worked for so long. We now have this tool, ForeFlight, that can help supplement this big picture of what's going on with all of the traffic. And it's even helped me call out air traffic control a couple times when I got cleared for takeoff on runway 13. I was with my dad. And we were about to take off out of San Marcos, and they cleared us for takeoff, and I could see an airplane on like a 1 mile final on ForeFlight. And it was super hazy, and we couldn't even see the plane out there yet. And it was like the sun was kind of glaring behind them, and we couldn't see the airplane. And they cleared us for takeoff, and we just kind of chimed in and said, "Hey, there's an airplane out there, and do you still want us to go?" And the controller said, "Negative." Having this tool right in front of us really saved that. So having traffic on and enabled and viewable up on the map is a big deal to me. I've totally made that a habit, and I check it no less than 5 times every flight. I'll just drop down the tab and make sure traffic is still on, because I want to make sure that I can see that stuff. And then we talked about connecting the iPad to an audio device. So that's a habit for me now. And then before I take off, and I like to keep this on during flight, is the hazard advisor, which makes your terrain kind of these vibrant colors and lets it really stand out. And another thing that I like to have up in conjunction with the hazard advisor is the profile view. You can even see it in the screenshot of ForeFlight there up on the screen, and it's such an awesome way to visualize terrain. Like in this screenshot that's on the screen right here, that's Colorado Springs, and you can see the terrain behind the airplane. We were in a Mooney departing Colorado Springs heading to Florida. You can see the terrain right behind us is red and yellow because it's above us. And it perfectly illustrates, kind of like where our danger zones are in terms of the terrain. And the profile view shows us all of the airspace and all of the terrain that could possibly be a conflict on this flight. And it's just such an amazing thing to have. So having Hazard Advisor enabled on ForeFlight is a really awesome thing, and I'm always in the habit of the layers and making sure that Hazard Advisor is on, and I'm going to get to have that visualization on ForeFlight because it's an awesome feature and it's there. So I want to make sure I'm using it. Do you find yourself using Hazard Advisor quite a bit, and just with your own flying or with students, Chris?
Oh yeah. So obviously, I do a lot of flying in Texas where I live, and hazards aren't too much as far as terrain, but we do have a lot of towers. And those
and tall ones too
they're sneaky, and they have guy wires with them. So this is really important feature that I use, especially when I'm doing basic training, when we're doing our stalls and maybe engine out procedures, those kind of things where we're really kind of sacrificing altitude during the maneuver. So having these terrain and hazard advisor things turned on help me maintain situational awareness and avoid those things for sure. So yeah, definitely something I have on in flight all the time.
Absolutely. And a little bit more about that profile view. And I'm going to plot a flight here over some terrain. And right now I'm actually in Kingman, Arizona. So I'm going to just do El Paso to Kingman, Arizona. I'm going to switch over to the profile view. Look at all that terrain that it shows there. And then it's going to populate here and show a little bit more. So, in a cruise altitude of 6,000 feet, it's saying that we've got minus almost 1,300 feet of negative clearance. So we're 1,300 feet below the highest point on that route. So this is another way that I like to pick an altitude. So I think the profile view is one of the coolest things in ForeFlight, and I love just cruising with that on, and it shows my progress with the little airplane going across the terrain, and I can see how close the terrain's getting to me, and I can see the airspace cropping up. Like here's El Paso's Charlie airspace that I'm going to be climbing through to get up and over the mountains there. And then scrolling over to Kingman over here, we've got all the other airspaces and little TFRs and all that kind of stuff. And like that's the Class D airspace that's just north of the town of Prescott. That's the Prescott. I know that's how they pronounce it there, but that's the Prescott Class Delta. So you can see all these little layers there that are the airspace. It's one of the coolest features, I think.
Profile view is such a powerful feature. We've added so many different layers to the profile view. So you can get turbulence, icing, different things. You're really able to get that 3D view. Speaking of habits, I think it's a great habit to get in to not only doing a top-down view like on the maps page here, but also getting that profile view and really understanding what kind of ride, what kind of things you can expect. And then also, on a side note, it's a great way to explain airspace in a three-dimensional explanation to students that have a hard time understanding airspace, because back in the day we just used sectional charts and whatnot. And then last thing, as a Embry-Riddle alum, I'm glad to hear you pronounce Prescott correctly. So
I corrected myself. I caught it. I love that you mentioned that it's such an easy or a great way to teach it, because you're totally right. It does really affect how you can visualize this stuff. And let me take this route. I'm going to drag and drop to a different airport here. Let's say the Buckeye VOR. Look at what it just did. And we can get this awesome visualization. We always talk about a Bravo airspace or a Charlie airspace, kind of that upside down wedding cake. Look at that right there. What other software could give you that kind of visualization? When I first discovered the profile view years ago on ForeFlight, I was like, wait, you can actually see the cross section of the airspace like that? That is so cool. So we can kind of move on to talking about approaching an airport. And I think this is really going to, for me at least, it centers around alerts and making sure these alerts are enabled on ForeFlight, which we had already talked about, making sure terrain alerts are on and traffic alerts, especially coming into and out of airports. You've got traffic everywhere. And I don't know about you, but when I started using ForeFlight and ADS-B kind of started to become a real popular thing, and I was starting to see a lot more traffic on my iPad and other people are getting equipped with ADS-B, it's almost, it got kind of scary seeing how much traffic is out there and how much I hadn't seen before. Or I see an airplane on ADS-B, I zoom into it on ForeFlight, I'm looking for them out the window, and then I see them going by in the distance, or I see them pass off my left wing or something, and I'm like, wow, I probably would never have even known they were there without ForeFlight. And of course, air traffic control never called them out to me. It's an interesting thing, like that there's all this data that is awesome to have, and it has definitely saved my butt a few times in terms of being able to see traffic and stuff and getting these alerts out of ForeFlight when approaching an airport. But it's almost kind of scary knowing that, like, wow, I used to fly without this, and it's kind of scary seeing how many airplanes are actually out there. Have you had any experiences like that, Chris, where you've kind of run into this where you're like, oh wow, this is a lot more situational awareness than I used to have. How did I do it before? Because I've definitely had that realization many times.
The big sky concept is not true. Like, there are so many airplanes out there, and our ability to see them visually is really important. You definitely need to be heads up, but why not? You have this advanced technology that used to only be in high-end jets and airliners, right? Now we have this stuff for literally pennies on the dollar. Why not? And I fly with one, and I think everyone should get in the habit of just having that. We have this technology, get in the habit of using it, and always verify, obviously visually, what you're seeing on the screen, but have it there as one more layer of protection.
Absolutely. And having these these alerts, kind of like you're talking about, use that technology that was really previously only available in high-end jets. We've got it now on on my iPad mini or on your iPhone right here in the plane. One thing that I use to kind of making a good approach or doing a stabilized approach down to a runway, one way that I use ForeFlight as a cue in this habit for me is when ForeFlight gives me an alert saying, 2 nautical mile final runway 08, or when I'm getting down to the runway and it says 500 for 500 AGL. Those are my audible cues that come through my headset to just look out the window, look at the runway, and kind of give myself a reality check. Hey, am I on a good approach here? Am I on track to normally make it to the runway? Or am I going to have to do something dramatic to fix this approach and make it to the runway? Am I grossly low? Am I super high? I came into Lago Vista Airport, which, you're from the Austin area. You're familiar with that airport. It's kind of up on this hill surrounded by, hills on one side and Lake Travis on the other. And there's hangars on both sides of the runway with tall trees. And it kind of gets squirrely getting in there. And there's lots of weird wind and stuff. And for some reason, every time I turn base to final for runway 15 at Lago Vista, I'm always super, super high. And there was one point, and this is kind of when this habit became, it got solidified. I was turning base to final, and I was too close to the runway, and ForeFlight called out 500. And that was my cue to check myself. And I had already kind of started that habit of checking myself when I get that alert, but this is where it really became solidified in me. And so I got that alert and looked up at the runway, kind of out the side of the windshield as I was turning base to final. And I was like, I am way too high. This is not good. I'm going to really have to slip it with full flaps, which I don't really recommend in the 172. And it's going to get, really squirrely really fast if I try to make this approach work. So I just did a go around. I went around, climbed, and did the pattern again. So after that, ever since then, I use these call outs from ForeFlight, like the 2 mile final or 500 feet, whatever it may be. I use those to check myself and make sure that my approach is okay. And I don't have traffic in my way. The runway is clear. And I'm ultimately on a quote stabilized approach, whether I'm VFR or IFR or whatever it may be. Do you use anything like that, Chris?
Well, I definitely let ForeFlight add to my awareness, right? That what you're talking about is that situational awareness, right? You're letting it cross-check that you have done your job, and we're all human. We don't do things perfectly, but we strive to. And this is one of those ways to kind of help us narrow in on that, right? So I totally think this is a great habit to get into, is to, again, kind of look at a bigger picture. Don't get so wrapped up on I have to land and exit that taxiway, or I have to do this or that, or I have to impress my instructor by making the runway land, making the landing happen on the runway. So these are ways to continually back up, continually reinforce that doing good habits, are going to enhance your safety. So I'm glad you put a go around here. Go arounds are not a punishment. They're a maneuver like anything else you do. They're like a stall. They should be practiced. They should be celebrated. I kind of teach the concept that a landing is basically a go around that didn't happen, right? If you just change your mindset a little bit, you can kind of approach it from an angle of safety, from from maturity, if you will, in the cockpit. So I'm really glad you called this out. These are excellent habits to get into.
Yeah, and I like that you're kind of highlighting that a landing is a go around that just didn't happen. And they should be celebrated. They should be practiced, because I know, lots of accidents have happened from somebody having to do a go around and not being prepared for it. And same goes for, of course, a missed approach during an instrument approach. That is a very dangerous area if you're not prepared for it. So to just change your mentality and be ready for it, and just consider that I am probably going to have to go around. That's what I'm expecting. And if I feel good about it when I get down to the flare, then we can attempt a landing. Same thing with an instrument approach. I am expecting to go missed. I'm expecting to not see the runway when I get down to minimums. Another thing that I love about ForeFlight that is kind of, maybe it's not necessarily a habit, but it's I guess it's gotten me in the habit of expecting it. And I think this really enhances safety. And that is the feature that's called auto show taxi. Once ForeFlight knows that you are down on a runway and your ground speed is decelerating, I think it's below 40 knots is the number or something like that. So when ForeFlight determines that it can realistically assume that you're down on a runway, it automatically brings up the airport diagram. That is just such an awesome feature to me because it reduces the heads down time that you may have, because it could be very tempting to reach down and try and tap the plates button and get over to your airport diagram before you exit the runway so you can see the taxiways and stuff. Or I know I've even seen it in lots of students and even fully matured pilots. There's this pressure to reply and satisfy the requests of air traffic control immediately. This desire to satisfy air traffic control when they call you and say, turn left next taxiway or turn left on Bravo, contact ground. And you're still on the flare, or you're still trying to just get the airplane stabilized on the center line on your rollout after landing. So I think the last thing that anybody needs to be worrying about in that scenario is pulling up their airport diagram. Of course, it can totally wait until you're off the runway, but just the fact that with that feature enabled in the settings, ForeFlight will automatically pop that airport diagram up, whether it's on the aeronautical map or whether it's on the plate version of the airport diagram, whatever you have set up in the settings. It's so awesome because now I'm in the habit of just looking down as soon as I'm off the runway and stop. I execute my after landing checklist, look down, and there's my airport diagram. And almost instantly, I have situational awareness as to where I am on the airport. And I think that enhances safety and reduces the risk of runway incursions leaps and bounds.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of being in a good habit of being pilot in command. Like,
bingo, yeah.
That is a learned behavior. It's of course telling ATC that you were unable to do something may be a little foreign at first, but do what you need to do as pilot command. Kindly and politely let ATC that you're unable, and then when you're ready, you exit, and you're, like you said, all of a sudden this taxi diagram shows up, and you can be in a good habit of not having to look down and preoccupy yourself when the airplane is in this kind of really critical phase of decelerating and making the energy bleed off where you can make a turn safely.
Exactly. So I have a couple things that I like to implement in post-flight procedures as well when it comes to ForeFlight. When we're talking about post-flight, there's a couple things here. The first thing that I will actually reluctantly admit that I am not in the habit of doing is using the logbook on ForeFlight. And I think this just goes to show how deeply ingrained habits can be. I am deeply in the habit of filling out my paper logbook. And it's, I'm just so used to starting on the left, putting in the date, type aircraft, and going all the way across to the remarks and filling out a logbook entry that way. But ForeFlight has this just wicked powerful logbook utility that could ultimately replace your paper logbook if you want. To me, I feel like there's something kind of nostalgic and sentimental about having that paper logbook there. But that's one thing that I do need to get in the habit of. Track log reviews and 3D track logs are another big thing. And I used this pretty heavily with my dad when we were working on his instrument training. I'm going to try and find a flight here on my iPad just as an example. And I'll need to go back to, I believe it was March for this. And it was just kind of an interesting, here it is, 2.9 was the total time. And this was a flight, you can see on the altitude there, we had 3 kind of plateaus of altitude on the graph in the blue. And those were 3 cruise portions. And where they dipped down to those troughs, that's where we shot instrument approaches. We cruised around San Marcos, and I can get rid of this here and show a little bit more here on the map. We took off out of San Marcos, went up to Taylor, did a VOR approach, came back and did 2 approaches with a hold entry and stuff into San Marcos. And this was the last flight my dad and I did before his instrument check ride. And it was, I totally beat him up. It was a 3-hour flight, and we did 3 different types of approaches, and I failed everything under the sun on him, including ForeFlight, and made him whip out his paper charts. But I remember my dad and I sitting in the hangar and going over this whole flight at length and, really zooming into his approaches and his holding pattern entries and looking at exactly what we did here. And okay, there's your entry and there's the other holding pattern. And this is where we got confused on this part of the avionics, but we immediately saw what was wrong and we corrected the issue. That was great. And then of course, being able to go to the 3D view in ForeFlight and really look down these approach paths And, we can see where we did a little bit of hunting on the approach, and we can see how well the heading was tracked on the departure off the runway. And, we can scrub through and just see our altitude and speed. And of course, all the ADAHRS data changing. And I think it's just such a powerful tool to be able to look back on every second of a flight, especially a flight that was used for, heavy check ride prep. This is one of those flights where I just sat there and said nothing. And all I would say is talk to my dad about, okay, this is what I want us to do next, and this is what we're going to do in terms of entering this approach, and I want you to demonstrate this and that. So I think it's just such a powerful tool. Sometimes I see it's a lot more beneficial to go into, the 3D mode versus the 2-dimensional mode that we're looking at here with the graph. It just depends on the type of training, but I know I've used this a lot, and going back on this data.
What a powerful way to debrief a flight, to get students to, recognize where they did well, because you always want to, show people where they've done well, and also where they need to improve.
Absolutely. And a big thing that I have noticed in the airplane, and of course I remember this from my own training, and as a CFI, I think it's really important to put myself back in the hot seat every now and then. Like, I recently just went back and did my seaplane training, and it reminded me of what it was like to be a student. Same thing when I went back and did my tailwheel training, or my CFII. It puts you in the hot seat again, and you remember what it's like to be in that vulnerable position of getting lots of stuff thrown at you at once. And that somewhat goes back to my concept of, the airplane is a training supplement. It's a training tool, not necessarily a classroom.
You have the settings correctly enabled. You can actually have a track log create a logbook entry.
It's yet another excuse, or it's yet another reason why I don't have an excuse to start getting in the habit of catching up my logbook on ForeFlight.
I'll add a little color to that. Don't.
Yeah.
It's okay to do a paper logbook and ForeFlight logbook at the same time. I totally understand that from a nostalgic reason. You can use ForeFlight to help crunch the numbers when it comes time for insurance updates, or when it's time to do an 8710 to go to do a check ride. So nothing wrong with that.
I am totally on board with that. I don't think I'll ever not have a paper logbook, because it is a very kind of sentimental thing, and it's just this tangible. It's a tangible book of memories, to me. So that's kind of how I feel about it. But ForeFlight is just this priceless, fully integrated tool here, and I absolutely love it. So habits are super important in flying. I've seen myself build bad habits. I've seen myself build good habits, and I've seen myself change some bad habits into good habits, which is a very tricky process. And like you mentioned at the very beginning, Chris, it's very hard to reverse a bad habit that a student creates or that a pilot creates, and starts to develop. So I'm all about, right off the bat, generating good habits that make a very seamless workflow and put together a very seamless workflow that can be centered around a tool that ultimately makes my flight safer and enhances the overall safety of this whole operation that is aviation for us. And we talked about pre-flight procedures and making sure that we have pre-flighted the device. As you have said, Chris, I thought that was a perfect way to illustrate that. You want to pre-flight your iPad, get all of your data right there in ForeFlight, and it perfectly compiles it with everything, making sure your alerts are on, you're properly connected to your audio devices and your Sentry to get your GPS and ADAHRS data, ADSB, etc. And then just making sure that, we have all of this situational awareness available right here at our fingertips in ForeFlight. Don't forget to use it. And what I've told people many times is just sit there at home, sit there with your morning coffee or whatever, and get on your iPad or your iPhone and just play with ForeFlight. You're probably going to discover a feature that you didn't know was there.
Well, so learning to fly, this concept of becoming a pilot, it's not only just learning a language, you're learning a culture. Okay. Mm-hmm. And part of that culture is developing these good habits, because those good habits, like I said earlier, are going to make you safer. But in the long run, it's going to actually make your training journey a lot more enjoyable, a lot more efficient, and ultimately, you can save quite a bit of time and money if you adopt and get on board with these good habits and practices. And definitely, ForeFlight is going to help you do that with all the tools, all the features, all the cool bells and whistles that ForeFlight offers.
Of course, yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there. It should be a supplement to the safety of your flying and enhance your flying. And we should engineer our habits in such a way that helps that and promotes that type of usage of these amazing tools that we have and that have been created by awesome companies like ForeFlight, and it all just makes our process so much more enjoyable and so much safer. So thanks so much for being a part of this, Chris. I think we see eye to eye on a lot of things with flight instruction and flying, and we've never been in an airplane together, but we definitely need to make that happen, especially because you're down there in my neck of the woods, and we'll have to make something happen. So thanks so much for being a part of this.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time today, Josh. I appreciate your insight. And yeah, we're definitely in alignment. And when you're down in my neck of the woods, we will go get some lunch together and do some flying.
I'm totally down for that. So from here, I can go ahead and hand it back off to ForeFlight, Sam at ForeFlight, and y'all can take it away for the rest.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. And thanks, Chris. That was a really great presentation. So before we run into Q&A here, just a few links for you to follow up with. Like I said in the intro, you can go to aviation101.com. His YouTube channel is, again, at Aviation101. And of course, he's on all the usual social media channels as well. If you want to learn about any of our new app releases and all of the previous releases and see what features were included in each one of those, you can go to foreflight.com/releases. And the same for webinars. Go to foreflight.com/webinars, and you can see recordings of both this webinar in the next couple of days, as well as all the other webinars we've done over the past few years. And of course, if you need any support, if you have any questions about ForeFlight or anything at all, just email team@foreflight.com, and our pilot support team will get back to you in no time. So let's move on to some questions. All right, so first up, we have, what do you think about teaching both real world scenario? Let's see, let me start that over. Real world scenario would be iPad malfunctions in flight, and you need to pull out the E6B and the paper sectionals. I think there might have been a word or two missing from there, but Chris, if you understood the substance of that question, can you go ahead and answer it?
Yeah, I get what he's saying here. Basically, how do you train, considering that the ForeFlight and the EFB are kind of the mainstay. Now, how do you train as a backup? And there's a couple different ways to approach that. And first thing is, why not? I mean, any way you train in the aircraft when you're learning to fly, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a great idea. Do some real world scenarios where you take the iPad away and see what the student does. See if they are able to handle that extra pressure, because that is a possibility, right? So what do? I think I personally would probably grab my second iPad, because when you get a ForeFlight subscription, you with a personal subscription, you get 3 devices, right? 2 iPads and 1 iPhone, or 2 iPhones, 1 iPad. So there isn't a reason why you couldn't just grab your other device and seamlessly transition over. Most of the information that you have is synced over into your other devices. Again, if you're doing, like I said earlier, which is to pre-flight your devices, right? So if you're going to be carrying more than 1 iPad, then you should be checking the battery, downloads, app version, all that stuff on all the devices, so it's a seamless transition. Or maybe you say, okay, you only brought 1 iPad today, and see how they handle paper and E6Bs. But that would mean that you've given them a chance to train with those from the onset, and so that's something you need to be doing with them even before you introduce the iPad. So good question. Why not get out there and do that?
Yeah, exactly. Next question here. How do I minimize the time I lose ForeFlight not available due to the iPad becoming too warm and shutting down? This has happened way too often when using the iPad in the airplane. And Josh, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good question, and I've had that happen a fair amount of times, actually. And this is also kind of the case with cameras too. So if I had to do lots of experimenting with figuring out why, obviously, these devices are getting hot. What is the best way? Like, is it direct sunlight that's doing it? Is it lack of airflow? What is it? And I ultimately boiled it down to lack of airflow. So the best way to really mitigate this problem is, for example, if you're flying a Cessna, just aim the vents down towards your lap. If it's overheating, it's probably hot outside anyways, so you're going to want the air open anyways. And it takes a surprisingly tiny amount of airflow across these devices to really cool them off. Like, for example, the cameras. If I've got the vents open inside the airplane in the cabin and there's a mild amount of air moving around, they don't overheat. And I found the exact same is true with the iPad. So basically, as long as there's just a tiny bit of airflow over the iPad, whether it's over the back of it or over the face of it, whatever it may be, that'll really help prevent overheating there.
Yeah, good answer. Next question. I'm a new CFI and I'm wondering, when do you think it is a good point to switch your student pilot from paper navigation to ForeFlight? It's a really excellent question. And I think it would make sense for both of you to take a shot at this. But Chris, if you want to give the first answer.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and get into this one. This is a very subjective question. It's the first thing I thought of was like, well, how do you know when to solo them? And you know, that kind of generic answer is when they're ready. If you're not a CFI, you don't know what I'm talking about. But if you are a CFI, you know there's like this this time where you just kind of see the behavior, you see the skill set of the student, and you just kind of know that they're ready for something. So you know, that's going to depend on each person individually. Some people you might want to wait quite a bit longer to introduce ForeFlight. It also depends on maybe just their propensity to handle, you know, maybe basic technology, operating an iPad or something like that. Whereas paper, they don't have to have as much bandwidth and they're not preoccupied with it. Like I said in the webinar, you know, ForeFlight EFBs, they're supposed to kind of accentuate what you do. They're supposed to help you. They're supposed to make life easier, not the other way around. So you know, very layered question or multifaceted question here, and it depends on the person. And you know, that person might want to spend a little bit extra time if they're having trouble, you know, moving up to the iPad and getting rid of paper. They want to spend a little bit extra time on their own getting to know ForeFlight. We have a huge support library on foreflight.com for them to get to know ForeFlight. We have all these webinars that we've done. There's tons of resources out there for you to get to know the product and how to operate it. And you'll see if I can sit down and do some one-on-one ground with you and cover some of the basics with ForeFlight. But yeah, when they're ready, you'll know, and just try it out. And if it's not going well, then, you know, pull it and try it again some other time.
Yeah, I totally agree with that answer. And I think kind of like what Chris, what you were just saying, is it's the type of thing where if you're a CFI, there becomes a moment where you just kind of know somebody's ready. And there are things that I can't really explain that they're so, you know, minute and little details that we pay attention to and stuff. And we're always trying to read a student, you know, try to figure out kind of what's going on in their head. How are they going about this process in their head? What's their thought process like, etc. And then, you know, when it comes to the fundamentals of instructing, we have the, you know, the 4 levels of learning. So we're watching somebody go from rote to understanding to applying that knowledge and then correlating it. So it's kind of, it just varies. Different people kind of catch on to things a little bit faster. To me, I always just like to pay attention to, I'm okay with letting somebody use a nice tool like that, like ForeFlight, so long as they know where their limits are with that tool. And when they hit those limits in their flying or in their flight planning or whatever it may be, they know how to accomplish that same task using another method. Basically, that's kind of when I feel comfortable, you know, with letting them use it. So that's a bit more of a higher, like a zoomed out version of Chris's answer there, but that's kind of my take on that subject. So I hope that clears that or answers your question there.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks both of y'all. Moving on to the next question. This is a sort of a similar one related to the reward system that Josh was talking about. So queue response reward, referring to this, can reward also be the verification? For example, queue is the landing light on, response, you move the switch, the reward, see the A meter increase by 1 amp. And Josh,
Yeah,
do you wanna, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way to look at it. And that's definitely, I think that's a perfectly valid way to kind of think about that cue response reward structure. The reward is usually when it comes to your everyday habits, even when it comes to not flying. And this is mentioned a lot in those books that I was talking about, like The Power of Habit and whatnot. The reward is more like it's your subconscious incentive to want to do it in the first place, to have that cue that then triggers the response. And then after you execute the response, you have a reward that goes along with it. And kind of without going into the details of all of these studies that have been done, it's definitely, I think it would be perfectly valid for your reward to be like maybe this like subconscious satisfaction that you get by flipping a switch and seeing something change. That's kind of what's going on there. What I was mainly getting at in terms of the cue response reward when it comes to checklist items is my reward is the satisfaction of knowing that this checklist is complete. I feel satisfied that I don't have to wonder whether I completed everything. I know that I completed everything. I did my checklist. So that's kind of my reward when it comes to that particular habit of doing a checklist. But looking at it as an individual reward per individual checklist item, that's another way to look at it too. And it's kind of an abstract topic to begin with, right? When we're talking about checklists and how they correlate to habits, we're drawing our own correlation here between those two topics, and it can get a little bit abstract. But I think what you mentioned there about seeing the ammeter move, for example, is a perfectly valid way to see that habit structure.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Next question here. Is there a way to add a checklist of an aircraft not listed? I have a Mooney M20J201. Chris, do you want to answer this one and maybe show how you can actually do that in ForeFlight?
Absolutely. So if we go ahead and share my screen here, there you go. Basically, the best way to kind of take checklists into your own hands here is to obviously open up ForeFlight, make sure you're on the most up-to-date version, okay? Then you're going to want to make sure you click on the More tab. So you're a little bit slow on the computer there, but more. Sometimes you might have. Yeah, let me bring that back. There we go. You might have to scroll down. So there might be some options behind or lower on the list there. But in this case, you see checklist is at the top. I'm going to go ahead and tap on the checklist. I'm just giving time for the computer to catch up here. All right, and so on the left, I have a list of all the checklists in my account here. And in this case, the pilot is looking to add a checklist that may or may not exist within the ForeFlight library. So I'm gonna hit this plus sign at the top of the page here next to the word checklist, and it's gonna bring up our little select template menu. From here, you're gonna, if you do think your aircraft exists in our library already, you could use the filter here to bring up the keyboard, which I won't do, but you could search that way, just do like a keyword search, and hopefully we have it. If we don't have it, then you're going to want to build it from scratch using our basic template here, the very first option. So tapping on basic template, it's going to ask you some basic questions to get that going. If you have a tail number already in your aircraft profiles, it'll just give you a chance to look that up. And so everything's optional here. So just type in a fake tail number here and hit done, and now it's going to bring up November 123 on the left-hand margin here. You're going to tap that, and you're going to want to have your existing checklist, your paper checklist, or your POH nearby. And my suggestion is to build the normal, abnormal, and emergency list. So the actual bullet items first. And once you have the lists built out, then you can go into each individual list and add the line items, right? The command responses. It's going to take you a little bit of time, and just be patient. Once you're done with it, you'll never have to do it again. Or even faster, if you have a friend that has a checklist for your type of aircraft, that friend can also email you the copy of their checklist, and you can simply import it into your checklist list there. So a couple different ways to do it. Build it by your 3 ways. Search in our library, build it on your own, or see if a friend of yours or someone on maybe like a forum, like a Mooney forum, could share one that they've already built. If you need more help beyond that, you can email us at team@foreflight.com. We have a whole checklist team that can help you get that done. And then I'll go ahead and move on to another question here. Also sharing my screen is, let's see. So I'm looking at the maps page. Where do I find the descent to destination instrument? So I'm going to move over to the maps page. Okay. And thanks, Sam, for bearing with me here. And I'm going to tap on the instrument symbol here at the very top. You'll see it highlighted blue. And it's going to bring up the instrument cluster at the bottom here. And you're just simply going to tap on any which one where you'd like to see that specific instrument name. So in this case, you are looking for the descent to destination. So I'll tap on the ground speed one here, and I can just simply scroll until I find descent to destination. All right, so there it is, descent to destination. Tap on that, and that now occupies that space. It's that easy. So cool, thank you for that. And I'll get back to you, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Perfect that you went ahead and covered that one as well. And what you said about emailing team@foreflight.com, of course, applies to any question you have about anything related to ForeFlight. We are definitely not going to be able to get to all of the remaining questions during this webinar. So if one of those questions is from you and you really want it to be answered, please email it to team@foreflight.com and they will be sure to get back to you. Moving on with the next question here, though. We got a ton of questions about the Bluetooth device that Josh mentioned that he uses to connect to the intercom. And of course, if you've watched Josh's videos, you've probably heard the intercom audio, so he is recording that audio in some way. Josh, can you briefly speak on what that device might be, as well as your recommendations for getting ForeFlight's audio alerts in your headset, since there were many questions on that as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So just kind of speaking generally here, you can connect your iPad to a Bluetooth device, or you can hardwire it if you have a device that has an actual audio input jack. Like for example, I fly with the Lightspeed Zulu 3. It's got an aux jack on the side of the remote, so I could actually run a 3.5mm wire from the iPad straight to the headset if I wanted to. The way most people are going to do it these days is Bluetoothing, which the Zulu 3 also has Bluetooth. And most other modern active noise cancellation headsets have Bluetooth built in. So if you just Bluetooth your iPad straight to your headset, as if you were going to listen to music or something through your headset, it's going to treat it the same way. You'll be hearing those ForeFlight audio alerts through there. The little device that I mentioned is kind of it's an extra step that I took to make it a little bit, so it's, let me put it this way, it's not quite as user-friendly as just Bluetoothing it straight to your headset. The reason I got a separate Bluetooth, like little battery-powered Bluetooth device to put in the plane is so that when I make YouTube videos and I'm recording, my audio recorder can hear the audio alerts coming from my iPad as well. And basically, I don't have an intercom in the plane that has a Bluetooth receiver in it. Most modern, like PS Engineering and Garmin audio panels will have Bluetooth on them. Ours is an older PS Engineering, and it does not have Bluetooth, but it does have a music input, like a music jack, 3.5mm stereo. So I basically bought a little Bluetooth receiver on Amazon. It was about $20, and it acts as a Bluetooth receiver, receives an audio signal from a Bluetooth device like an iPad or an iPhone, and from there you plug the device into the music jack in the plane, so that I'm getting the audio alerts on the entire intercom in the plane. So anybody sitting in the plane with a headset on, plugged into the intercom, including my audio recorder, will hear those alerts. Whereas if you just Bluetooth it straight to your headset, you're the only one that's going to hear those alerts. So I hope that answers your question. You can just search on Amazon for portable Bluetooth receiver, and you'll be able to find hundreds of them, I would be willing to bet. It's a very common little device, and tons of companies out there make them, and they're very cheap. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm sure that helps. There were just a ton. We got a huge influx of questions related to that after you mentioned it. So thanks for addressing that.
Sure.
Next question here. Do you have any recommendations for the best iPad mini to purchase? Should it include Wi-Fi or should it be Wi-Fi and cellular? I do want to plug our own webpage that ForeFlight has for this. If you just search foreflight.com/buying guide, and that there's a dash between those, buying -guide, that has a lot of information and our recommendations on iPad devices and Wi-Fi and cellular, and how much data storage you need and all that stuff. So go check that out. The iPad mini 6 does work great. Of course, the 5 is recent enough that it's still going to be pretty snappy. But if you are looking for something that's going to last as long as possible, the mini 6 is also available, and it's the first iPad mini to use the newer like slim bezel form factor that you see with the iPad Pros. So that's also an option. But yeah, let's move on to the next question then. While flying VFR, I sometimes like to put an IFR intersection into the GPS. Is there a way to display IFR waypoints on the VFR sectional chart in ForeFlight? Josh, do you want to take this one as well?
Absolutely, and I can show this on my iPad here. And I've done this quite a bit. I've taken tons of VFR cross countries, going all over the place. And, maybe I just want to scoot around in airspace and I want to pick a waypoint on down the road that'll kind of get me going to this, to the side of the airspace so I can dodge it or whatever. And I want to also put that waypoint into my panel mounted avionics. So it helps to be able to see those waypoints. So right here, we got a VFR sectional. I know just to the west of the San Marcos Delta airspace here, we've got a lot of waypoints out there. The quickest way to bring those up on the map, so I'm going to drop down the menu here. I'm going to select aeronautical. And then on the left-hand sidebar there, you've got some buttons here where you can kind of turn on and off airspaces and all that kind of stuff. I'll declutter it just a little bit here and show. I'm going to click the box that looks like it's got a couple little tick marks or lines coming out the sides. Those are airways. And that actually, you can see that illuminates the airways with waypoints there. And I'm actually going to turn off the sectional to see it just a little bit better. And I'll turn airports and airspaces back on as well. So by turning that layer on, that populates our airways, and you can see like Betty, Zingo, Guards, Pinch, Shep, all of these waypoints that are out to the west. That'll populate it right there on the map. So if you've got a route, you can just drag and drop and select one of these waypoints, just to get you to maybe dodge some weather or dodge some airspace or stuff. So that's the quickest way that I would go about bringing up IFR GPS waypoints onto the VFR sectional, which is actually how I like to fly on cross countries, just like that, how you see it there.
Yeah, great answer. And we definitely recommend using the aeronautical map in addition to, even if you're only flying VFR and you want to use the sectional and you say, oh, I don't need to see those IFR intersections or any of that stuff, we definitely recommend still having the aeronautical map on, even if the only layer you're going to have enabled is the airports layer, because that means that you can just tap on any airport marker to immediately access information about it, as opposed to having to tap hold and then find the airport in the list that comes up and then get to the details from there. It's just a lot easier to have that aeronautical map enabled, even if you're not going to have all of the individual layers enabled. Next question here. What is the refresh procedure for the pack feature? i.e., how do you refresh packed data after you've already downloaded it? This is a great question. And Chris, do you want to also take a shot at that?
Absolutely, and I will need to share my screen for this. So it's got a couple different things that we're going to look at, but the first and foremost is I'm going to go into more settings, and I'm going to scroll down until I find what has to do with the pack feature here, and you'll see right here where it says pack enable auto check. Okay, you're going to want to make sure that is turned on. So what's that going to do? That's going to allow you ForeFlight to automatically check if any changes have been made, any additional data is available for download or consumption, if you will, from the time that you created the flight until the time you actually start moving and go fly offline, essentially. Because ForeFlight originally is designed for you to download all of the data that you need to go from point A to point B and not be connected to the internet anymore. So what does that look like? So if I go into the maps page here, and drop the FPL tray. Okay, let the internet catch up here. If I create a route, and I can quickly do one that I've done recently here. Let's go John Wayne to Teterboro. You'll notice a little exclamation point will appear on a little suitcase, and this is our pack feature. So as soon as it gets caught up here, I'll tap on the pack feature, and it's ForeFlight's essentially going to draw a 25 nautical mile corridor along our entire route of flight. Okay, and it's going to look for all of the data that you would need to fly offline to go from point A to point B, like I said. And so here it's seeing that I'm missing a significant amount of weather, airmet segments, TFRs, fuel prices. I'm even when I get up towards Michigan, I even go near Canada. So it's saying I might even want to consider my IFR Canadian high chart. And then all of these other United States charts that I might want to download. This is a huge, like 3.68 gigs. Obviously, I'm going cross country in a Gulf Stream here. So, and I don't have any of these other states other than Texas and any border states downloaded. So it's going to automatically check that for me. So let's say I took the time to pack, and I'm still continuing to do my pre-flight planning, and I'm checking different things, features in ForeFlight to brief myself, and a new NOTAM comes out. ForeFlight will automatically pick up on that additional information. It will throw out another little exclamation point here on this little pack feature and let us know that there is more downloads. So that being said, this second and any pack updates after that should be a lot smaller and faster. Okay, I'll move over into the flights tab. You'll see this very same flight from John Wayne to Teterboro, and I'll just gently scroll down, and you'll notice there's a second place here for me to pack as well. So getting a good habit, talking about habits, getting in the habit of packing is obviously a really good habit to be in, but also making sure that you are hitting that pack button where it is featured. So the flights tab here is definitely going to be geared towards your filing and getting ATC on board with your flight that you're about to do, whereas maybe the maps page is more for in-flight use and that moving map situation awareness concept. So settings, maps page, flights page, and using that pack feature. So it's all right there for you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think my response to that person when that question first came up was basically just bring pack up and you'll just download any updated NOTAMs and weather data, assuming you've already got all your charts packed. So we always recommend packing as soon, basically at the soonest point to the flight as possible. So if that's before you leave your house to go to the airport or before you leave the FBO to go out to the ramp, definitely recommend doing a quick pack right before you do that, just to make sure you have the most up-to-date information. So we are way over time here, so we are about to wrap it up, but I do want to just get one more question in. So how do you access the measuring tool shown in the takeoff abort segment? Josh, this was when you were showing how you could measure the amount of runway available and judge when you should be off the ground. So if you want to go ahead and demo that on your iPad.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a good question, because I feel like it's a feature that a lot of people don't know about. I know I've like casually done that in front of pilots before, and they're like, "Whoa, how'd you do that?" And it's definitely a useful feature. I use it a lot in cruise and of course planning for the abort point. So I'm just going to take 2 fingers and let's say I want to measure how close the San Marcos Delta is to the edge of the Austin Charlie there. So I'm just going to tap 2 fingers on the screen here, and I can move them together and apart, and it stretches this little ruler thing across the screen. So I just put one edge right there on the Delta and then one edge right there on the Charlie. We can see that it's about 6.3 nautical miles apart there. Gives us all sorts of other data too, about how long that's going to take at a certain ground speed and what the magnetic bearing or the magnetic course is going this way and that way. So we're on the aeronautical view here. So for example, we can zoom right back into San Marcos here. Let's say we're taking off runway 8. I'm just going to tap 2 fingers and spread them apart so we can, I actually got a little bit wide there. Well, and we'll put one end there at the approach end and one there at the taxiway, for example, and 2,643 feet is what we're showing there. So that's kind of how I like to use that feature. And you literally just take 2 fingers, tap them both at the same time anywhere on the map, and you can move them around and measure anything you want. Super useful feature.
Yeah, now, Josh, if I can have you do something, yeah, if you can zoom
Sure.
like all the way out to show the whole US, open your flight plan and bring up profile view, and then slap the ruler down there and see what happens.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see what you're getting at. Yeah, so I'm going to just drop the ruler there and let it populate. It takes a second there because there's a lot of terrain. But you can see as I move it, it's starting to highlight all this different terrain. And of course, it's red with hash marks because the altitude is set to 10,000 in my flight plan. And obviously 10,000 won't clear the Rockies and stuff there, but like going out here out east, we see the Appalachian Mountains and all this crazy airspace out east and stuff. So yeah, that's a feature I've used that before, totally forgot to demonstrate it there, but it's such a useful thing to be able to just, pop a line real quick with your fingers and be like, okay, from here to here, what am I looking at in terms of airspace? Or like if I want to go over to Louisiana, there's the Houston Bravo and there's the Tursa and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that I'm glad you mentioned that, Sam. That's an awesome additional feature to highlight.
Yeah, and something that I actually just learned recently that I didn't know for a very long time is that the when you're using that feature, you actually shouldn't be looking at sort of the line through the center of it. You should be measuring based on the line at either the top or the bottom. And we've had some people note that some of the information shown ends up being different. If you notice, the stuff along the very bottom of the ruler was upside down. And that becomes much more apparent when you try to measure a really big distance like this. You start getting those great circle effects coming in, and the distance will be slightly different. You can even sort of see the curve there in it. So it's just something to know. You should always be referencing the topmost line or the bottommost line and not the center line, because those
Absolutely.
are what correspond to those, that data being shown.
That's definitely a good thing to highlight there. So yeah, and I've applied that too, because it's also, if you look at, it's a little bit hard to see. I don't know if I can get it over a bit of a lighter background or something. But those top lines almost look like little crosshairs. So it's very easy to just go ahead and put those top lines on whatever you're measuring. So good tip there.
Yep. All right, so with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Definitely go check out Josh's YouTube channel if this webinar wasn't evidence enough that you should be listening to what he has to say. Check out our app releases at foreflight.com/releases. Like I said, there's also the buying guide. You should check that out. That's /buying-guide. You can register for more webinars, and you can watch this webinar starting tomorrow or possibly soon after that at foreflight.com/webinars. We will try to get this exported and uploaded to YouTube and that webpage as soon as we can. And of course, as always, just email team@foreflight.com if you have any kind of question about ForeFlight, and our pilot support team will get back to you very, very quickly. So thanks everyone for attending. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Josh, for a really great webinar. And we'll see you guys on the next webinar. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you later.
Thanks, everybody.